Hey, good morning, good afternoon. I hope that wherever you're tuning into this, you are well and enjoying an awesome day. This is Preparing for Sunday, where you and I take a look together at the upcoming Sunday's scripture lectionary text. This is for Sunday, September 15th, 2024. Our day in the church is the 17th Sunday after Pentecost in year B, the Mark year of the Gospel readings. This is for us at St. Stephen, also back to church Sunday, where we hit a little bit of our own rhythm and stride here and get back to offering a full litany of activities during the week and throughout the month. Also, following weekly worship now, we will go back to having Sunday school for all ages. The nursery is open. We have youth and kids Sunday school. We call it Pathfinders here. We will have the back pew gathering for adults, where we think about Lutheran ideas and theology, and then think about how that affects the way we live in the world. So we're going to do that each Sunday up until Reformation. And this all kicks off this Sunday, the 17th Sunday after Pentecost. The text for us this day is a heavy one, and one that all people of faith should be deeply prayerful in light of Jesus saying this. It is Mark 8:27 through 38. And if you're a pauser, don't quite pause yet. This is the first of three. This is one of three times in Mark where Jesus is going to predict his death and the way that that death is going to occur, namely the cross. We in our situation know that this is where the story is going to go. The people in Mark do not, but this is the first of Jesus' predictions of his death. And for me, preparing for Sunday is going to take on the feel of a tale of two texts. A tale of two texts. Mark 8 is the center of the Gospel of Mark. There's 16 chapters in Mark, and we're sort of at the middle. And if you know the way stories go, that puts us at the sort of crux of the story. That puts us at somewhat of the big shift of the story, where the narrative really starts to pick up, because you're in the middle. You've built the characters, you've built the world, you've explained who people are, and now in the 8th chapter, the story is going to hit its sort of crescendo and build up. And that starts with Jesus' prediction of his death. So that's now going to become the whole focus of why Jesus and why all these characters in this story has developed prior to this. In Mark 8, we get the first of three Jesus predictions, and Jesus talks about this in a way that talks about it as not just a thing that happens to Jesus, but an example to be prayerful about if you want to live in the world as a person of faith. Do you want to live in the world as a person of faith? Let's look at a tale of two texts, all right? So this might be where you want to get the pause, or where you want to get the notebook out. I'm going to jump back in time. One of my big foundational beliefs with the book of Mark is that Mark gives us a thesis on the effect of his gospel. That there is a story in it that tells us how the whole rest of the gospel works. That is the parable of the sower. The parable of the sower is found in Mark 4, and it's verses 1 through 9, and I'm going to read it. And the thing that we're going to talk about is the types. The sower is God. God is sowing. But if we want to talk about what it looks like to hear what God sows in our lives and to be in tune with it, we're going to talk about the kinds of paths that Mark delineates in this story. And then I'm going to tell you that every other story in the rest of the gospel has to do with somebody being one of these types of paths, okay? Even that reading today from Mark 8. So I'm going to read this, and what you'll need to do is sort of keep track of the paths. What are the paths that the seeds fall on, right? So chapter 4. Again, he began to teach beside the sea. So the teacher there is Jesus. He's beside the sea. Such a very large crowd gathered around him that he got into a boat on the sea and sat there, while the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. So voices carry over water. Jesus is building something of an amphitheater by people sitting up onto the, I'll call it beach, or up onto the seaside, and then he's out on a boat to project his voice to the people. And when he gets this set up all arranged, he's going to tell them this parable. It says in verse 2, he began to teach them many things in parables, and in his teaching he said to them, listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. So that's the first one. Verse 5, other seed fell on rocky ground, where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. And that's the second. Verse 7, other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. And that's the third type of path or landing spot. Verse 8, other seed fell into good soil and brought forth grain, growing up, increasing and yielding 30 and 60 and 100-fold. And he said, let anyone with ears to hear listen. And that's the fourth type there. And so the four of those paths or places where seed can land tells us some things about who we are and who God makes us. God is the sower. God's word is so abundant that God can sow the seed anywhere. God has no care really for even, the bushel is so bottomless that God doesn't even have to be that careful about where God sows it. It can go everywhere. But seen from the other side, we start to talk about who is what kind of path, and who might I be, and what do these paths look like, right? So the first one is the path itself, where the seed falls and it's too hard, it sits there, the birds come and eat it, and that's the first one. The second one is rocky ground, so there's a little bit of dirt here, life finds a way. It's like a little seed that can find its way into a concrete crack. There is a little bit of soil there, and it can find some depth there, but beneath it there's just no bedrock. There's just bedrock of shale or whatever, and it can't get deeper than that. The sun is hot, the water is not a lot, it withers this one away. When the sun comes up, it is scorched and withered, and that's the second kind. The third falls where there are also thorns. So again, God is just, kind of wanton. God sows the seed. The worry about whether a person is ever going to have a chance to meet God or hear the gospel or have God break into their life is taken away here, because God is just giving such plentiful opportunities. The seeds are going everywhere. And the third one is that it falls in a dangerous spot with thorns. They're both competing for the same resources. The thorns grow up, they grow around this thing that's grown up. They kind of defeat, they're kind of better. They wrap around and they choke out the seed that should have been there. This is sort of like maybe an example of wheat and tares, maybe an example of goats and sheep. The Bible uses that imagery a lot here, but it's here that we're hearing this thorns thing. The fourth place where the seed falls is finally the good soil, where the benefit, the product that comes out of it is God's work that produces 30, 60, 100-fold. And then Jesus says, let those that have ears to hear, hear. So this is about the sower, who is God, God's self. It's Jesus, it's love, it's joy, it's peace, it's justice, it's all the things we're looking for out of life. The sower is sowing it. But if you look at it another way, it's about who we're being called to be. Who are we? What kind of ground would we like to be? God, I think, obviously sows the seed because it wants to have a product. Do we want to be the product? All right. So that to me is an easy thesis, a lens through which to funnel all of the other remaining texts of Mark. And Mark 8 to me is no different, and we can jump to that now, because this is actually this week's reading. All of this has been in a reading that we're not even going to hear in worship together, but we are going to hear this from the 8th chapter of Mark, and it begins with the 27th verse. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, Who do people say that I am? So when that question is read aloud, it's also a question for us. Who do people say that I am? The seed is being sown in Christ himself. What path, what soil, what ears have you heard with? Who do people say that I am? And they answered, so the disciples that are with Jesus answered, John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. So an important figure that teaches great things, right? And he asked them, but who do you say that I am? So not just what has the story been in the past of what works well, what are you looking for? And do you have the ears that hear, right? Peter answered him, you are the Messiah. And Jesus, it says, and he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Jesus has the job of sowing and bringing forth the 30, 60, 100-fold, and he wants to sort of navigate that in his own way. There's a reason why Jesus wants to navigate that his way, and that is the gist of this gospel reading for this Sunday. It says in verse 31, then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days arise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. And this is an explication of paths or soils, and he's pointing out to us the kind of soil we tend to be, and if we want to be a different kind of soil, what that's going to look like. And if you have ears to hear, you'll hear this, and not everyone might hear it. He called the crowd with his disciples to them and said, and this is verse 34, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. And that second reading there is our reading. I'll point out something, then I'm going to talk more about these soils. I want to quickly take a pit stop to talk to you about Caesarea Philippi. There are fresh water springs there. This is quite a sight in the ancient world. A lot of sort of commerce, I'll say, built up around these natural springs that were at Caesarea Philippi. They became a place with a lot of religious import. The god Pan, the Hellenistic god Pan, is associated with these springs. There was a lot of political wrangling over this territory that Caesarea Philippi is in. It's not far from the Sea of Galilee, and it's a place of commerce. It's a place where people go for sort of healing, and it's a place where people had fought over. So it's a really politically and religiously fraught place. I don't really know if we have a thing like this anymore. Maybe it's like our upcoming election, where it's just a political and even religious, fanatical, really staunch thing. And he's taken the disciples to a location that is basically, essentially as fraught as the next 2 months will be with this election. But it's a place where he can sort of demonstrate that. Maybe this is like going to a national convention of a party and sort of talking there. Okay? So the question that he asked there is who do you say that I am? What do you hear in that? And keep in mind these 4 types of paths. So to me, when Jesus makes a prediction of his death, he's talking about what it's necessary for God to do to sow the seed. He's saying that God comes to us and sacrifices a lot to dig out of God's abundance to sow this seed. And then the question becomes, that Jesus doesn't just do this to do it. Jesus does this for you and I. This is salvation. This is a thing that we need to be prayerful about, to have ears to hear. And I'll tell it like this, you know, Jesus is going to talk about his cross, and he's going to talk about taking up your cross. And there are four paths with this, you know, the way that this fits into the soil of Mark 4. The path where the birds come and eat it up would be the kind of soil where there's no cross and nobody cares. You know, it just sort of falls, and you know, I'm doing well enough over here on my own. I enjoy the springs, and I can get myself into my car and I can take care of myself, and so I don't really care. I couldn't care less about faith, religion, any of that. And that's sort of this one way of looking at Jesus' cross, and that will definitely weed a lot of people out at this point, where people will be like, I don't need, you know, a cross, let alone a God, right? So the second way that fits these paths is this rocky ground. And the rocky ground, to me, this no depth, where other things, where a challenge comes up and it's scorched and it's withered, to me, that's going to be the cross, you know, that's work. That's going to be these sort of maybe evangelical places where everything is, hey, if you just have the right kind of coffee and the right kind of music and the right kind of scripture, and you pray hard enough and you're a good person and you do A, B, and C, your cross is this extra work you've put into it. You know, you had to get yourself up on Sunday and enjoy this message and it was fun, but the work is that, hey, you pray hard enough, and you're dependent on yourself enough, and everything's going to be okay. That has no depth, and that has no work of God in it. That's totally dependent on the person thinking that they want a better life, which we all think, but hey, I'm just going to dig deep and get it. There is no depth to this, and as soon as any challenge comes up, we realize that we are not capable of navigating the world on our own. There's no depth to this, there's no God, and evangelical churches feel, you know, are enjoyable, and people go right out the back door just as fast as they come in the front door, because there's just no depth. When something hits them or some trial comes up, they've gotten what they need, they're good people, and but oh, you know, I'm just in the same boat as everybody else, and they're just going right out the back door. The sun scorches that, all right? So they'll tell you that that's a cross, but it is not. That is not a cross. It's not a cross to go and have the music you like and the coffee you like and to have it feel good for you. That's not really a cross, even though evangelicals will constantly tell you that's what it is. It is not. There's no depth to it. The third type of soil here are the thorns. The thorns grow up and choke it out. The example I'll have about that is that Jesus himself, when he was on the cross, heard all these things. Save yourself. So he got all the way to the cross. He saw the necessary path there. He got to the cross. Knows that life, faith, faithfulness, prayerfulness, the true dependence on God is difficult. But you get to the moment and you sort of don't go the full way. It gets sort of, you know, eaten up by something else. This would be like Jesus pulling himself down from the cross before you even get there. And lots of people will do this. They'll be faithful for a long period of time, and then they just sort of start to become, you know, into the things that have grown up alongside the faithfulness. While they were becoming faithful, they were aging. They were becoming more successful, more you know, cared for financially, and then sooner or later they find themselves not elevated on a cross, but really into their own stuff and timing. Sometimes we do this when we're like, hey, you know, I'm trying to be a faithful person, but look at this great family God's given me, and we sort of replace God with our family or with our stuff and what happens with that is sometimes we find ourselves happy, and sometimes we feel like we've come a long way, but what ends up happening is because that was never a cross, the cross is still in front of us, and we find ourselves maybe lonely or passed by or not partaking of those things anywhere. Our health falls apart. The idea of a cross, then we've substituted, and when we did that, it's just this nefarious, subtle thing. That is the one that this text is talking about, saying don't do. That's the one that this text is the most worried about. What does it profited a man or a person, I'll say, to you know, have tried to gain their whole life and lose it? Jesus is sitting in this very political, very religious place, and he's saying, what has all this stuff profited a person when at the end they haven't learned any sense of humility, need for God's grace. They haven't learned that the biggest thing you can do in life is die and set yourself into the hands of a loving, scary God. Most of the time we like the cross all the way up to the point where the actual death happens, and then we just sort of find ourselves saying, well, that was fun. The spring, though, and my family, and boy, I'm a faithful person. And so then we find ourselves maybe 10 years later with a diagnosis or with something, and we're like, we've moved on from faith, and we don't quite know how we're going to be saved. The last one here is the good soil, the one who hears this, and it is super hard to hear, in that Jesus has to predict his death 3 times. Peter cannot hear it, in part because where they're standing is so thorn-filled. Peter is becoming a sort of thorn on the path to Jesus, and Jesus is saying, get behind me. This has to go all the way to death. And so what this is about having ears to hear. The only way we can have ears to hear, we love our lives too much. We're looking for happiness and stability too much. The only way we can have ears to hear is to put our self into the hands of a loving, scary God, to die in our baptism, and to know that God alone resurrects us, but we don't like it. Most churches can't sell it. They can't get people in the front door by telling people, well, you're here to put yourself in the hands of God, and you're not doing that very well. And since they don't tell people that, or since that doesn't sell very well, they just don't tell people that. Hey, you're here to get coffee, do step A, B, and C, and be happy. Well, that's not going to be salvation, because it's dependent on people, it's dependent on me, it's dependent on you, instead of this depth of who God is. And so this is about the few that have ears and will hear it. Luther talks a lot about how few will hear the gospel and really know what it's about. Few of us will know what we're getting at here. The depth of it, the faithfulness of it, the sheer dependency on God. You have to depend on God to understand how loving God is in Jesus. When you depend on yourself, you don't need Jesus. And so that's really the crux of what's going on here. God is a sowing God of plenty. There's plenty of justice. There's plenty of peace. There's plenty of joy. There's plenty of salvation. There's plenty of Jesus in the world around us. But we don't want to hear how to get ourselves into God's hands. We don't want to hear it. We don't like going all the way through with the cross. Sometimes at various paths we talk a good game, but we very seldom go all the way up to a depth. And when we get to the depth, we don't usually find ourselves being faithful, crying out to God. We find ourselves, trying to look at our 401ks. And is salvation really going to come from that? Probably not. So this is a bad text to preach, because the thing I have to sell to you is your death. And I have to die in front of you. And it's hard for me. It's hard for you. We're not going to ever do this perfectly, but we can do it much better than churches that tell you how great you have to work to get everything put together. This is a death. It's a difficulty. It makes us count on. It makes us dependent on God. It tells us that the only way that you're going to stay sane through all this next 60 days of politics, and the only way that you're going to stay sane, is to die to yourself and what you think everything has to be sorted out, and to constantly be back in the hands of a loving, scary God. And that's the example Jesus sets for us. That's the example this text sets for us. It is not a good salesmanship text, but I'll do my best Sunday to try to sell that. Who do you say that I am? What do you hear here? I'll try to ask that question of you. I hope what you hear is that God does not leave us in a spot of death, But what we tend to do is replace God with the idol of ourselves or our own accomplishments. We don't even know we've been choked out by the thorns. And then if anything happens, we wonder why everything looks so difficult and so bad and we're so stressed out. Because we haven't learned who cares for us and who loves us, and that is God, God's self, through a cross. But it's a loving God who not just sort of lays this cross in front of us, but says the cross is not the whole story. My gift of resurrection is. And that resurrection is the gift that goes to the people who can hear this, who can be prayerful, Lord, make me the good soil. And what you're praying for when you say that is being dirt. You're asking God to be dirt to death. And that's not a thing we like to ask, and so we don't. And what we're sitting here with is how to lose our lives. And, quick addendum here. I'm not talking about staying in violent situations where you're made to be dirt by other people. I'm not talking about being belittled by other people or allowing yourself to be a pushover. That is not what I'm talking about with the cross. If you're in a situation of danger or that sort of thing, it's okay in that case to save yourself. That is not a cross that God wants you to bear. The cross that we bear is this certainty of our own death, certainty that no matter what we try to control, we don't. That these existential things and these external things of our own health and all that hit us. I do not want you to try to carry your own cross. I'm going to say this again in the sermon Sunday. Jesus himself did not carry the cross alone. So that's important here about this attack on individual works. And it's important, I think, to sit with that and think about it. This is not an easy thing to sell to you, but I hope today that you are good soil, that you're the kind of dirt, and that you pray to be the kind of dirt that knows that I'm dead, you're dead, and that God alone breathes life into our lungs with every moment. And that is the call, and that is the living into resurrection and fullness. And I hope you can hear that in what I'm thinking about with you here. So that was a reading from the 4th chapter of Mark, but primarily I want you to think about the 8th chapter of Mark. And I also think this would be a fun Sunday to join us. It's back to church Sunday, and we have a lot going on, and it would be a good place to wrestle together and not individually with what it means to die, to be dirt, and be fully dependent on life-giving God. All right, stay safe. I appreciate that you joined me here with this, and I will see you soon.